Hello everybody, I'm Nicole Lamartine. Welcome to the Choral Eye. Today we are talking about conducting irregular meter, those meters that are in odds for each measure, fives, sevens, or possibly even eights. So before we talk about conducting irregular meter, we have to know the difference between macrometer and micrometer. So the micrometer is the smallest unit of pulse within the measure. It is the unit of pulse, it's the bottom number. For example, the macrometer are the larger groups of rhythmic units that can be made up of how many micropulses in each bar. So let's look at this example of 6/8. The micrometer, we have 8 notes and we have 6 of them. So the micrometer is 6. Now if we were to take this group of 3/8 notes and treat them as a subdivision of a larger pulse, the larger pulse being the dotted quarter note, this is the macrometer. So micrometer of 8, macrometer in a conducting pattern of 2 with a subdivided 8th note into 3s. The same thing too can be explained in a 6/4. So the micrometer is 6. The macrometer again is 2. So if we're conducting a micrometer of 6, you might know that it looks somewhat like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But if we were to take the macrometer is in 2. 1 and 2 and okay? Micrometer, macrometer. So let's look at 3 guiding principles that will help to guide your understanding of which pattern to conduct in. So the first rule is the larger the number on the bottom, the larger the groupings to conduct. So instead of conducting the micropulse of 8, usually 6/8 is in the larger macropulse of 2. The second guiding principle, the smaller the number on the bottom, the smaller the unit to conduct. So in this 6/4, most likely we're going to be in a feeling of 6, rather than the 6/8 with the larger number on the bottom, which will most likely be in a conducting pattern of 2. The third guiding principle is tempo. Almost always, the macrometer will be used for faster tempos when you have rhythmic groupings that you want to elicit in your gesture. The micrometer, conducting every pulse, will be for slower tempos. Okay, so now let's talk about irregular meters. And I described them earlier as anything that's odd. A combination of 2s and 3s in the bar. Okay, so when you think of 5, you can break down 5 into a group of 2 and 3, or 3 and 2. The macrometer is the number of groupings of the rhythmic unit within the larger pattern, which makes the larger pattern. So a group of 2 plus 3 would be a macrometer of 2 with the longer beat on 2. The micrometer, if you are conducting in a larger pattern conducting every single pulse, the last grouping of the bar begins to the right. So for example, if I'm conducting in 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so you can understand then the groupings within the bar as you're conducting the micrometer. Okay, so the first order of business is to find the 2s and 3s. So if we look at this bar of 5/8, we know that we have 5/8 notes worth of rhythm in the bar. So let's count them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5. And we just discovered that usually we're in groupings of 2s and 3s within the bar. So a 5/8 bar, for example, could be broken up into a grouping of 2 plus a grouping of 3. Or it might look like this, as a grouping of 2 and a grouping of 3 eighth note pulses. Or we could have a group of 3 plus 2. And here's another way to write that: 3 plus 2. So I'm starting to visually identify my groups of 2s and 3s. Let's look at the bar of 7/8. Of course, we know we have 7 eighth note pulses worth of rhythm in the bar. 7/8 can be broken down into 3 plus 2 plus 2, or 2 plus 3 plus 2, or 2 plus 2 plus 3. So the larger number of pulses per bar determines the number of groupings or the possibilities that you can have within that bar. Okay, so finding the macrometer once you've visually identified your groups of 2s and 3s. First question is, how many groupings of 2s and 3s are there per bar? So you're counting the groupings. So if you have 2 groupings, maybe a 2 plus 3 or a 3 plus 2, your pattern will be 2 as a macrometer. If you have 3 groupings of 2s and 3s in the bar, your pattern of conducting the macrometer will be 3. So let's try this. And I like to think of pulling the taffy for the larger groups of 3 within the bar. Okay, so let's take a 5/8 pattern, for example. We might have 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. The macrometer is 2, but the longer beat on 2 gets to be pulled a little bit, and I think of pulling the taffy. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Or it could be a grouping of 3 plus 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Okay? So I'll turn around here so you can conduct with me. Let's do a pattern of 7/8, 2 plus 2 plus 3. 1, 2, 1, 2, pull and 1, 2, 1, 2, pull and Now let's do 3 plus 2 plus 2. Long beats on 1. And 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. So pull the taffy through the rebound of the larger beat in the pattern. Now let's look at some music so we can identify our 2s and 3s and come up with our macrometer for irregular meter conducting. So let's look at some music for the 3-step process of determining how you'll conduct this mixed and irregular meter music. This is Shiru by Aharon Harlap, which is a great piece, and I like to use this one as an example because the meter changes almost every single bar, and most of the bars are irregular meters. So this is less than 10%, so well within the fair use. And first step is to find your groupings of 2s and 3s as your rhythmic unit. So I'm going to go ahead and mark these in my music. In this first bar of 7/8, I see this grouping as a group of 3, and then followed by a group of 2 and a group of 2. Again, groups of 3s and 2s, and 3s and 2s. So once I've determined my groups of 2s and 3s, then I can go back and mark in my music which ones are the long beats. So I use a triangle to determine or to designate the long beat, and then just a tick mark for the short beats. So triangles for 3s and a tick mark for 2s. Okay, so now I have determined my groupings of 2s and 3s. I know which beats are the long beats, and all I have to do now is go back per bar and say how many groupings do I have per bar. And so in this first bar of 7/8, I see 3 groupings. So that will be my macrometer of 3 with the long beat on 1. The second bar, I've got a two groupings, so it's a pattern of 2 with the long beat on the first beat. In the next bar, again, we go back to the large macrometer of 3 with the long beat on the first beat. So let's look at the next bar, bar 4. It's in 8/8, but it's not in a duple feeling. So we've got a feeling of 3, we've got a feeling of 3, and a grouping of 2. So our macrometer for this 8/8 bar is going to be 3 with 2 long beats. Now, what happens if you get confused and it's not clear on the page what groupings you should use? So let's look here at the bottom of the page, bar 9. Here, we have choices in the 5/8 bar. Is the grouping a 3-2, or is it a 2-3? So it's not completely obvious, and so let's look then at the text. The text will help us determine our groupings and our macrometer, okay? So the text is miyom liyom, and if you know Hebrew, you know that this little word here is not the accented syllable. The accented syllable really is yom, miyom liyom. And so if we were to speak this, bahashruhu miyom liyom, the accent, or the agogic accent, really is here. So this bar becomes a 3 + 2 with a macrometer of 2.